welcome to everybody to our meeting for the month of May. And thank you for the time that actually you are giving, to join us. So interesting to note that I have the presence of Rudolf Steiner himself from the spiritual hierarchy as we are going to undertake this spiritual discussion. And there's a very interesting revelation as well, which came about. So the topic for today's discussion is Rudolf, the life and teachings of Rudolf Steiner. You see, one of the reasons why I was requested by the spiritual world to undertake this discussion is that, we can introduce some of these great teachers who came from the spiritual hierarchy during our, last century, so that we can really form a picture of where we are actually heading towards. Just briefly about Rudolf Steiner. He was born on 27th of February 1961 in Kraljevic, Hungary, right? And he was born from Austrian parents, and now that part, Kraljevic, where he was born in Hungary, is now a part of Czechoslovakia. So the interesting thing to note about Rudolf Steiner was that he had these psychic abilities right from a very young age, when he was only 4 or 5 years old, you see. So Gopi Krishna has talked about him that he actually had an awakened Kundalini, or, the rising of cosmic currents. So not going too much into the detail, which will be covered by John Peter, it's interesting to note, and this is the revelation then, that when actually he was, at the age of 19, he met whom he calls as his master. Now, the interesting thing that has been revealed just now is that who Rudolf Steiner called as the master was actually an adept, but you see, he was somebody who was sent on a secret mission to Earth, so that, this big body of language, which was of knowledge, which was opened up by Steiner, he was the key to it. So what happened was that Rudolf Steiner called this adept as his master, and he actually was the one who not only initiated him and told him that what his mission was, but he actually, after that age of 19, connected him with the Akashika Chronicle, or the Akashic records. Basically, you see, what the Akashic records are is where actually the entire evolutionary history of at least our solar system, or how we are actually evolving, is recorded. So Steiner actually had a direct insight into that. I'll give you an example of his insight. Like, I'm speaking, and all of you can sort of, listen or view me, on your TV screen or computer screen or mobile. Similarly, he could actually directly look into that. And Rishi Master Vyasa Dunu has said that as we are actually progressing, probably say 30,000 years from now, every one of us will have that capability where we'll just sit down at a place and we'll just project, like a projector when you go to a movie, and this screen will appear in front of us. And in that screen, any of the previous events of our life, or what has actually happened before, can actually be played. So that's where we are actually heading towards. So you see, Steiner has made a huge contribution to humanity, during his, a short lifespan that actually he was there. After the age of 40, what he did was that he toured the whole of Europe, covering Great Britain, Scandinavian countries, and Europe, and he gave more than 6,000 lectures. And the beauty about his was that one lecture he will give in the morning, and another lecture he'll give in the afternoon. And like that, he kept on actually giving lectures. And there are more than 350 published works, which are mainly actually his lectures. And he covered a very broad area, philosophy, education, agriculture, you name it, right? And there are these Waldorf schools as well. He taught this biodynamic farming, you see, where you don't use artificial fertilizers and all that. But basically, my focus has been, and what I see as his greatest contribution is, you see, the Hindus had actually talked about human evolution, but it is spread and it is scattered and it is not clear. And so did Rishi Master Byansa Duno as well, who had given 7,500 lectures, whom I call Rishi. So he has given parts of that. But Steiner actually has given in a spiritual, scientific way with great clarity, you see, looking into those records, where the evolution started, where we are now in our evolution, and where we are actually heading. That is probably for the first time in the history of human beings that we have got a very clear picture of where we are and where we are supposed to go. Now, why this is actually important for spiritual aspirants is that, of course, one aspect is there that we realize the presence of consciousness, but realizing the presence of consciousness, we have also got to realize that consciousness is also present, disguised as this changing reality for the world of images. So everyone, you see, that consciousness as being this changing reality, as being in that world of images, basically has to have a clear understanding of, what is this entire blueprint of Maya or changing reality, from where we have actually come, where we are, and where we are going to be heading towards. Because you see, people like Ramana Maharishi, Rudolf Steiner, even though they have advanced to such a stage where basically it is nothing but timeless living, actually, you see, but even then they come back because somewhere it has been stated that the human family consists of 65 billion human beings or human souls. And actually, just like your family is there, it is one family. No one has any escape or what you call as the ultimate freedom until every one of us has evolved to that stage where Rudolf Steiner or Ramana Maharishi or Jesus or Gautam Buddha or Rishi Master Byansa Duno, you name it, have actually arrived. Okay, not digressing too much from our discussion for today. Finally, on 30th of March 1925, you see, he was born in 1961, but on 30th of March 1925, Rudolf Steiner left his physical form to return back to the spiritual hierarchy. So just with these few words, I just let the words flow in whatever way they flow. There is no preparation for this. I'll hand it to John to continue with our discussion. John, can you please come in?
Yes, Anil. Thank you for that. You've summarized. Can you hear me now?
Yes, very clearly.
Right, okay. That was great. You've really summarized his life. I'll just give a few more sketches on it and then actually go on to summary points of what his teachings are about. Now, for some of you who don't know who Rudolf Steiner was as a picture, I'm going to just share a picture of who he was, just so you get a, I think, whoops, can everybody see that at the moment? Great. Okay, so that's in his approaching 40 or his 40s, and that's just a picture. I sort of compared that to Ramana Maharishi, and I had to think about Ramana Maharishi, where in his presence, Ramana emanated life force as such, where people could have just satsang in his presence. I'm not sure that it was the same with Rudolf Steiner. He was a great influencer, but I don't think he had that same influence just by his presence. So that's an interesting thing. So I'll leave this picture up at the moment, and I just want to go on to just something a little bit about his life. And as Anil said, that in the Rudolf Steiner basically was part of our world destiny, but when you actually realize that whether in the East or the West, the spiritual world sends its messengers at the appropriate time. So in the 20th century, there was Ramana, who worked with the impulses arising from the Vedic teachings, Beniswar who worked from an Eastern European mystical Christian and theosophical perspective. And then there was Rudolf Steiner, who taught from what we call a Rosicrucian Middle European perspective. Different. But what's happening here is their teachings are coming together. So when Rudolf Steiner was asked by his followers as to whether there were any other initiates like himself alive at that time, he actually said yes, there were, but he was the only one who could conceptualize what he had perceived in the spiritual world into understandable concepts. Now that's important, understandable logical concepts. The others, you could say, spoke in symbols, and you needed a lot of work to actually and meditate on those symbols as well to get the higher meanings. But he was able to string across, in thinking, where you and I can understand what he said. So he focused and mainly expanded upon the nature of duality of the physical and invisible worlds. And I'm stressing this because sometimes that could appear to be on the surface in contradiction with some of Ramana's teachings, when he spoke about duality. But as Anil pointed out to me, he said that in the higher sense, and Steiner said himself, in the higher sense, there is oneness, but in the maya of life, which we're living, there is duality. And that was one of my great difficulties in trying to interface Ramana's teachings with Rudolf Steiner's. But yet, they can be interfaced on a higher level. And in a certain sense, there are ever higher levels of reality as we consciously develop towards that which Ramana pointed to. Now, Rudolf Steiner's life, basically he lived, as Anil said, he had his spiritual sight or perception, and yet he couldn't share this with those that were around him. So he grew up, you might say, in an academic environment where he eventually received his doctorate in philosophy. He was actually a speaker who lectured, but he couldn't lecture on his spirituality because there was no one to receive it. And it was only when he managed to speak at the Theosophical Society, when he was invited to speak there, that he was received spiritually. And that was around the age of 40. And so he produced his further works, and as Anil said, in 1925 he passed away with about 300 written books. If you wanted to get the full intake of his work, 300 books basically came out of Rudolf Steiner's work, or direct books, whether they were of lectures or books that he wrote. So it's an enormous quantity. So what I really wanted to do today was really speak about key points on what Rudolf Steiner presented, just as a summary. So I'm going to share another screen, and I'm just going to go down at the moment and just speak on key points, and hopefully I can talk to them. And the idea is to get an essence in, I don't know, how many minutes do I have, Anil?
Yeah, till 5 o'clock, yeah.
Okay, to 5 o'clock. In about 30, in about 35 minutes to speak about an essence of what his actual main teachings were about. And Anil alluded to something about evolution, of course. So I'm just going to, can everybody see this screen?
Yes.
Okay, so these are the key points. There's about 5 pages of these. So the first thing which he really sort of demarcated was that we as human beings, we're made up of separate members. And he called these the physical, etheric, astral, and he went to spirit, ego, or I, this eternal part, this eternal core that reincarnates. This is what we have today. But today, only the physical is visible. So what I'm seeing in front of these screens are your physical bodies, but sometimes through your smile or through your gestures, I can actually see something that's deeper. I can see part of your soul being reflected in your physical. So we can see the effects of what we call the etheric. The etheric is the life of the human being, like the plant. We can see the astral, which is the soul component, which the animals have. And we can see that eternal part of the human being, which makes us individuals. Now, in the future, there will be 3 more principles added to us, which are higher. And this is interesting. We haven't been what we are for that long, and we won't be that in the future. There'll be principles called manas, buddhi, and atma added into the distant future to us as human beings to complete us. So you could say that we're an unfinished work in progress. But now another principle which he gave, and this is what Neil was referring to as well, that humanity, the earth, and our cosmos, now together with our associated invisible guiding beings, are evolving, and so we have a codependency. So in a sense we could say the earth and the human being are one. We cannot, we have the choice eventually, if we develop spiritually enough, to leave the earth. But in essence, we may be committing what we call a sin of omission if we don't come back to help the earth. So we can see Ramana and Deniswa Junov at the moment are helping us to evolve. So there are those that go ahead of us, and those that go ahead of us can now voluntarily come back in a form in which they can work and help us to evolve further. So we as human beings must work to fully understand these processes so that we can now, and this is what's important, only now can we consciously create ourselves and co-create our destined future as we evolve to higher levels of perfection. So it's only until recently that we could do this. So it's important to realize when we meditate, when we work on ourselves and practice self-development exercises, we are co-creating ourselves. Now, we've reached a point where we will no longer evolve unless we help with this evolution process to perfection. If we do nothing, then basically we will de-evolve. So some of these points, maybe I could have got them in better sequence, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. Now I'm going to talk about after death. I'm not sure that whether you're aware of this, but in the main, after death, we live the major part of our existence in working from the spiritual world. So on earth, we live in normal times. This is not normal times at the moment. There are some events that are going to come upon us where every soul is coming down to populate the earth for certain things to happen. But after death, we live the majority of our existence is in what we call the spiritual world. And one task there is that we have is to transform what we have achieved in our past lives into a new suitable existence for our next life on earth. So are we going to come back with wisdom? Are we going to come back dull? Are we going to suffer? Or are we going to have more happiness? Now this is determined in our life between death and a new birth. But however, we here on earth now must become more conscious and understand life after death so that we can actually consciously work in cooperation with those individuals who have passed away. Now, there's a peculiar thing about after death. After death, there is no change that we can bring about other than what we brought about whilst we lived on earth. But here, we can help our loved ones who've passed away, or those that we knew. So it's important that we start to become more conscious of those who have passed away. There are still these wonderful ceremonies to those that have died and to people, our ancestors or whatever. They're still happening, but they're getting less, as I put it, especially in the Western world. So the cooperation now needs to be more on a conscious level. So as I said, after death, we cannot change or improve what we have achieved or learned. We can only work with those qualities we have brought with us from our previous life. So we can also help those who have passed away. Now, the interactions between those who are living and those who have departed, these must increase into the future. As I said, the earth and humanity are one, and we actually need the earth as our home. We cannot do without it. If we choose to leave the earth and not come back to its evolution, we cannot evolve further. So we need the earth to evolve further into what is destined for humanity. Now, that destined state, there's a state called something that we almost cannot understand, and that's called the Vulcan state, which is in a far distant future. It's a sublime state where we will have developed the ability to transform consciously our physical body in a totally different way to what we think of physicality at the moment. So it's very hard to understand. But in this future destined state, we are destined to become what we call co-creators. So we've started as a creature. We get help, we get supported. Many beings sacrifice themselves for us to grow, and we evolve into a further state where we're now able to what I call create. And that will come in the far distant future. Very hard to understand, but there is a possibility of a little understanding with this. So we today, it's important for us to consciously transform ourselves, otherwise we will de-evolve. And so I'm now giving summaries. I'm not explaining why, and I don't apologize for this because there won't be enough time to really go through these processes. So the material earth at the moment is dying. And I think you probably realize this, that the deserts are growing, species are starting to become extinct. We're actually poisoning the earth in a certain way. And in a sense, the death processes bring about our consciousness. I know this sounds strange, because even physiologically, our nerve system, if you sort of understand our nerve system, it's very difficult to reproduce nerves if they're severed. I think you can, if you know people who've broken a nerve, it's almost impossible to mend. So the nerves are in a dying process, but through that, consciousness, thinking arises. If it wasn't for the dying, we would not be able to have the understanding. We could feel, but we couldn't have understanding. And if you look at our understanding, how crisp and clear it is, like the objective world. We can look at objects. We can analyze the objects. We can have logical thoughts. But all this comes about through a dying process. So it's an interesting concept, not through a living process, but through a dying process. And so we must consciously now raise ourselves beyond these dying processes. And that requires hard work. We might say it's a pathway of self-development, balanced self-development together with meditation. Eventually, we'll be forced to do that. Otherwise, what will happen is that it will be forced upon us through suffering. And here's another thing that Steiner presented, that thinking must be worked upon and be consciously developed. Otherwise, it will diminish. And I've noticed this. If you probably noticed, the first time that I really noticed its acceleration, when whatever you think of Donald Trump, I won't enter, but the idea of truth and logical thinking, together with COVID, Donald Trump, and whatever, started to accelerate. Certain stories, I think it was said, I'm only using him as an example, not as, but effectively, truth and logical thinking started to diminish. And many people started to use YouTube and YouTube authorities for their points of view. I'm not saying the YouTube authorities were wrong, but when I've spoken to a lot of people, they couldn't express in thinking what they actually believed. They just believed in the authorities. And so I realized, no, they're consciously giving up their thinking. So one of the things Steiner emphasized was that we must consciously work on our thinking. Everyone here is understanding through their thinking. Whether you agree or not, that's not, you're free to agree or disagree with what I'm saying, but you are using your thinking, and you're using your logical thinking, you're using your past systems of thought, beliefs, to say, am I saying something okay or not, or, semi-okay. I'm not even worried about it. What I hope is that there's an openness to understand what I'm saying, not to agree with it, but to understand it. So if you have a different view to me, I hope I can understand your view. And that's the way we should work into the world, that we hope we can take an interest in the other person to understand them, not agree with them. The other thing Steiner mentioned, and this is where Anil sort of mentioned that he talked about evolution, Steiner mentioned that time had a beginning, and before that was a state called duration. Now in this state, we can call it, I'll use a term, you may not, it was just called Old Saturn. Now Old Saturn was a previous incarnation of the Earth and was where our first traces of our physical body occurred. This was the beginnings. There was only, of us, the physical body was the first stage of our development. Now, so this state of duration could be seen as a pure undifferentiated self, as an infinite consciousness, which we can actually still experience in our spiritual development today. But you imagine an infinite vastness of pure consciousness. No space, no time, no up, no down. And today it also, to enter this state can also be terrifying, because there is nothing but pure unadulterated consciousness. We can even call that self. We can say that one can enter into the beginnings even today. And so we can still experience it today. Why Steiner was saying we need to know how we've progressed, because we can then know what we can do to be co-creators of our future. And that's important. Can we co-create our future? In a sense, we do that even today when we self-educate ourselves, when we improve ourselves to get a different job, when we create tasks and become whatever we do, or we take on a self-development. We're actually co-creating ourselves. But also, we need to be co-creators of the future Earth. Oops. Now, Steiner worked with the concept of evil. And what's evil, I suppose? I suppose, just, I don't know, can you think of something that is pure evil? Some of you may know the history of World War II, where people were just ruthlessly obliterated. Extreme torture, that's the extreme of evil. But to a certain extent, we as human beings, if I can use the term, if you think about yourself, we're neither totally good nor totally bad. So we have aspects of evil in ourselves, and we've got aspects of good in ourselves. And what we can do is we can have a choice where we don't respond to those evil impulses. We can strengthen ourselves against those. But he says, so what does it mean evil will increase? So for instance, jobs in the outside world can become heartless. We're just economic slaves. That's kind of evil, isn't it? It's taking away our humanity, and there are jobs. So what's happening in the corporate world today, and I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it's a quality. The managers are paid let's say a big bonus if they get productivity up. So the managers then force their supervisors to force their employees to work extra hours. What happens when you work, if you've got to work 12 hours a day and you've got children to take care of and everything else? Now, do we need to sort of be forced to become economic slave? But I'm just giving you an example of where evil will increase in the world. But not only that, you may have noticed, and I've noticed, physical road rage is an example of where if people don't work on themselves, the physical anger will grow. So we could say evil will become worse. So it's important for us to understand what evil is and to also recognize it, that evil, we can also call it ignorance. This provides obstacles for us if we get mildly hit. I'm saying mild because there can be big hits on us. If we get mildly hit, it provides obstacles for us that we become more conscious. To give an example, if I walk into a glass door, I'll know to look a bit more consciously for the glass door in the future. And so obstacles are provided for us to become more conscious. It sort of pushes us into you might say, more consciousness. But there's also another way we can become more conscious by taking up in freedom a balanced pathway of self-development, where we can work practically into the world and spiritually transform the world and ourselves. So for instance, the economic system, if we can actually put spiritual principles into the economic system, into the political system, into the environmental system, if we can put spiritual principles, bring down from the spiritual world what's needed, then humanity can evolve in a harmonious way. And unfortunately, what happens when we don't evolve in a way that's harmonious with the spiritual world? Let's say we become very materialistic. If you think about the war in Ukraine and Russia, it's a sad situation. I believe, I don't know, there's somewhere from 100,000 to 200,000 souls that have died in the last year. This will increase if and the actions of us, if we have a life of ease and materialism, those actions may affect events over the world. So it doesn't matter that we are materialistic here. When I'm saying materialistic, enjoy the world for ourselves. I'm okay. I don't care if others suffer. It's just up to me. Then maybe our actions over the other side of the world will be affected. So the spiritual world chooses a weak spot around the world, and in this case it was Ukraine and Russia. So it doesn't mean that real causes of that war started there. It could be that it started here in Australia. I'm just putting, something, or in America, if I use that expression, through those materialistic impulses. And there are reasons why these events happen in the world. But if we know that these events are going to increase, and it's up to us to transform the so-called evil, in a sense, we take it on into ourselves. I know this is hard, but to forgive the situation and to work to get it fixed up. I'm just putting it. That's hard work. Forgiveness is a real hard task for us to take on, especially if it personally affects us in a bad way. Now, this is another thing. Traditional religions will diminish, and conscious spirituality needs to take its place. So why will traditional religions diminish? You may observe it amongst in wherever you live, but one of the things of traditional religions, they were based on authority. They were based on something that happened or was initiated a few centuries ago, and so no longer people say yes to it as much as they did in the past. Now, if one can really take on a traditional religion and work with it, fantastic. But a lot of people are now saying, no, I don't want to work with that religion anymore. Or you look at what it's done, because in the West here we have some of the religious orders. There's been a lot of sexual pedophilia and other sorts of things that has been exposed. Before that was tolerated and the spiritual impulses could sort of flow through. Today people are seeing some of the things for what it is, but also the traditional religions didn't work from a conscious spirituality. And what did I mean by that? It means that concepts can be added one to the other, and it makes sense. This is the modern consciousness that we have today. Now, this wasn't there when the religion people, and today it's still relevant. People just needed, tell us what to do. I don't need an explanation of why, but give us instructions. Give us this, so we can do this and practice these rituals and practice whatever development pathways. And it's no longer sort of holding as much. And in actual fact, the traditional religions, especially in the West, they're really sort of diminishing. They talk about percentages of people who are not going to church, which they went to last year, etc. So it's rapidly accelerating. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? It's just part of evolution. So what was correct for an age in the past starts to become not so correct, and something new needs to come about. So conscious spirituality, like what we're doing here, we can discuss things, we can talk about it between each other, and take on whatever we need from it and reject whatever we don't need. We don't have to take on whatever a person says. Now, one of the major principles of Rudolf Steiner, he talked about the Christ being. Now, I won't go further into what that is, but I'm going to talk about the Christ being as opposed to the Christian religion. Now, there's a big difference. The Christian religion took it on in a childlike fashion, this Christ being. And this Christ being, or the impulse given by this being, needs to develop into the future and is central to Earth evolution. I'm going to take one example. When you and I take an interest in another person, when we take a real interest, especially someone who we don't like, and ask in ourselves, where are you coming from, brother? And we really feel that and try and take an interest, despite the animosity that that person may have to us, is really an example of the Christ impulse, to take a real interest in the other person. Now, this wasn't around a few centuries ago. It only is a recent phenomena. If we go back to Buddhism, Buddhism was the first teachings of compassion of other human beings. But it's only now that we take an individual interest, and this has come from the Christ impulse. So it's got nothing to do, well, it's got something to do with the Christian religion, of course, but in a sense, one can take the Christ impulse, being a Hindu, Muslim, or any other religion, if one becomes interested, a true interest in the other person. So that's something unique that Steiner wanted to get across, that the Christ being, as opposed to the Christian religion, is central to Earth evolutions. Now, human beings, and another central teaching of Rudolf Steiner was that human beings are unique amongst the spiritual beings in that we have the possibility of freedom, and thereby human beings are able to love. The concept of freedom was not really possible for most people until about, I'll use the time of 1413. That's when the Earth went into a state of the effect of Pisces. So we're in the sign, we've been in the sign of Pisces since about, I think, 300 AD, but the actual effects, the spiritual effect of Pisces really didn't begin until 1413. When we started to look at the world, we changed. Something changed in humanity. In Europe, you had people now saying, we need to look at things now. We don't need to philosophize anymore. We need to look at how many legs does a spider... Okay, a spider looks like an insect. In the old days, therefore, it's got 6 legs. But a spider's got 8. Now we need to look at a spider. We don't need to philosophize about it. And so the age of discovery began around 1413. So this is why, to a certain extent, freedom wasn't part of religious traditions, because those religious traditions that began before 1413 would not have fully understood what the concept of freedom was. So it's only until 1413 that freedom came about. So what is love? Now we know what a mother's love is, but that's not the love that we're talking about. If we take a real interest in a person, especially one that's got animosity towards us, and we try and, without any judgment of that other person, try to understand where he's coming from, isn't that love? We're taking an interest. Sure, the mother's love, a mother will die for her child to protect the child, but that's given. So will a lion, or so will another animal die for its young in order to protect the young. But that's a given love. That's a love that's instinctive. But this love is something that we have to develop in the future as we develop freedom. And we are only in a little way to freedom. I give this gesture that I'll put my hands out, I'll see if it can be. If we take, we have developed this much freedom, but we must develop that much freedom as we go into time. So we're only on the first steps of freedom. And this is another interesting thing that Steiner put forward. He said we shouldn't listen, or we should work towards to not listening to any authority, including himself, including the Christ, including God. So sometimes this work that he printed was the philosophy of spiritual anarchy. But what he said we should listen is to what we have consciously come to ourselves from our higher aspects. Now, if it comes from our lower aspects, we're listening to an authority of our emotions and our feelings. But if we come through that true higher aspects, and I think most of you might have come to that, where you sometimes come to something just entirely out of yourself. So authority is to be used only for guidance. Does it feel right? So any of the things that I've said, the idea is to take nothing of that unless you feel comfortable of it. Same thing with Ramana's teachings. Only unless you feel comfortable and you've made it your own do you take it on. So everything else that's come from authority from the past, we shouldn't take it on unless we make it ourselves and come to it ourselves through working with it. So that's important, because so many people want to be told today, tell us what to do, how to do it, but they forget that they need to come to it themselves and not to just take it on blindly. So that's something he was quite interesting. So he said, don't listen to me unless you've made it your own. Don't take me on as an authority. This is what I'm saying. This is what I've come to. If you feel akin to it, take it on, understand it and work with it, but don't take it on blindly. He was almost pleading because a lot of his followers wanted him as the authority, and that's something he didn't want. He wanted people out of themselves to take it up for themselves. So now, and this is something not popular with spiritually developing people like ourselves. Human beings must embrace and spiritually and consciously transform materialism in a moral and practical way. We need to get into politics, but we need to spiritualize it. We need to get into economics. We need to get into management. We need to transform it if human existence is to be palatable for us into the future. As I said, there are forces working that are anti-human, inimical to human beings, and life will become miserable for many human beings unless we take it on to get to. So what does this mean? It means we need to get to know science, not to disagree with it, not to agree with it, but to get to know it, to take an interest in the world as to what's come for us. So we really must spiritually embrace materialism, if I put it this way. Now, the thing about materialism, it's going to be with us to the end of this earth age. It's not going to go away. And there's a good reason for it. As the earth dies, the fruits of materialism will support human beings in this dying earth. The earth must die for us to have spiritual life. I know this sounds strange. We cannot leave it. We must be with it. But the earth is dying, and we need materialism, the positive, the moral fruits of materialism to support us. Look what we're doing now. Spiritually, we're working, and we come from all parts of the world. Now, isn't that fantastic? This is a real positive effect of materialism. So we need to understand and work with these tools that we have. The next point, I'm almost finished there now. The next point, we must understand in detail how reincarnation and karma operates. There's individual karma, there's group karma, and there's world karma, which is the destiny for us, which we really as individuals have got to participate. You're participating in a world of materialism at the moment, looking at me at Zoom. This is world karma. Group karma is what happens to a group or an organization or a country. The individual karma you will know of. But we've got to consciously understand in detail how it operates. Okay, this is the last page. So we must, as I said before, we must understand and work with the results and methods of science. Why? Because in that way we're able to enter the spiritual world, use its methodology, in other words, the conceptual logic of it as we bring it down, and to be able to understand spirituality. So Steiner called his work spiritual science not because it's able to be reproduced by everyone. It can be reproduced by an initiate to an initiate, but it can't be necessarily reproduced by you and I. But he used that methodology used his own physical vehicles to perceive in the spiritual world. Now, we don't have to take on the conclusions of science, but we can take on the empirical evidence of science. So in some ways, we can complement the results of science with spiritual knowledge. So the empirical evidence is there. We can't necessarily deny what's in front of us. Sure, it's Maya. But the point is we need to spiritualize this knowledge, and we can only spiritualize it if we understand it. And we can only understand it if we develop our thinking. Oops. Now, spiritual knowledge, you may or may not be aware of this, constantly changes and will change to suit the maturity of human beings as they evolve, from the simple to the more complex. Now, Anil talked about evolution. It was not possible for human beings to understand evolution, like it's not possible for a 5-year-old child to understand nuclear physics. Now we've matured, we've got to take the spirituality, what's necessary for today. And just the interesting thing, which I haven't been able to really get to fully myself, but some of you may appreciate it, that through conscious, inspired artistic work, there is a gateway to perceive spiritually. And sometimes through artistic work, people have been able to bring down the spiritual world into art. And it's important not to forget about it and make maybe even science artistic, economics artistic, or whatever, to bring the artistic and the human element into material life. I apologize if I went through very quickly with these points, but what I wanted to do was to get an essence, or the major essence, of Steiner's teachings. And I think that's important, that these are the essence of his teachings. As you say, as you may feel, some of these are contradictory to other points of view, but in a sense, they're all on a higher level united, but it's up to us to unite them through our thinking. And I believe they can be united. I don't think they're in contradiction. On a lower level, they may be, in concept-wise, but on a higher level, there's no contradiction. So with that, I'd like to end my talk. Thank you.
Okay, yep. Thank you, John. That was very good. Vijayji, can you please summarize?
Yes, Anilji, just a minute. Thank you. Oh. Sahana vavatu, sahanau bhunaktu, sah viryam karavavahe, tejasvinavadhitamastu, ma vidvishavahe. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you, everyone. This today's topic on the life and teachings of Rudolf Steiner, and the key points were quite enlightening from the perspective of each individual, and how the individual has to work towards growing within the purview of materialism, and to grow spiritually onwards on the pathway to evolution, to the highest goal of life, which is self-realization. Realization as in knowing your true self. So what the key points, just to summarize, which John kindly sort of gave in detail, to summarize, is you've got three basically bodies within this material world, which is the etheric, astral, and the ego, which is the I, which are basically called the manas, buddhi, and atma. And these this individual with these aspects are provided, each individual is provided with a guiding light or beings or spiritual gurus, as it were, to help the individual evolve on the spiritual path. Now, uh, he explained the basis of karma uh, through evolution, which was very well put from the perspective of uh, your actions and your responses to circumstances that are presented to you on a day-to-day and a minute-by-minute, every minute of your life. As circumstances are provided to you and incidents happen, your response or reaction provides the crucible for your future evolution, either that or de-evolution, based on how your response is. So evolution is a must in the process, through the process of manifestation in this world. And that is, of course, whether it is you're de-evolving or evolving, that has to happen. It can never be stagnant, because the world is a flow. Manifestation is a flow, and that flow has to be constant. You cannot change. And the human being, in the process of its life through this manifestation, goes through certain aspects, and then, very akin to the theory of karma and reincarnation, has to then come back to this earth plane to further evolve towards that self which is ever present. And that evolution, by the term evolution, you mean transformation. Now, that transformation of the individual human being is critical, because one has to go beyond and evolve beyond the dying process as we know it, because the dying is dying basically of the ego. So you've got the manas, buddhi, and atma. And the manas is basically the mind, which is filled with thoughts, and buddhi is the intellect. So you discriminate, discern between right and wrong, etc., etc. And then you have the ego, the I. That needs to be transcended. The I needs to be transcended, because that I itself is a notional thing that Bhagavan Ramana Maharshi actually said very clearly, that this I, this little I, this ego, is only notional. It's not, doesn't exist. It is only arrogated to oneself, saying that it is me. And that is why all this manifestation, this I, this world appears. But when we are talking about manifestation, let's come back to the topic and the subject, which is the key points of Rudolf Steiner. And he said that while working through this manifestation, one has to develop oneself. Self-development and meditation is very are very important and key ingredients for an individual to grow. Use whatever methods. These are only two methods given: self-development and meditation, but there could be many other methods you can use. In all, there are various traditions, like yogic traditions. You've got plenty of other methodologies to use, and you can use any which method, as long as there's development towards and growth towards that goal of realizing your true nature, which is self-awareness, pure consciousness. He also goes on to say that time had a beginning, which is a beautiful and a very truthful statement, because time had a beginning because it was created. And before time, prior to that, it was known as the word which is called duration. And essentially, we are pure, undifferentiated self, which is that ever pure existent self, as infinite consciousness or pure awareness. That is what we are. And that Rudolf Steiner, in his key points, has expressed that, which is so beautiful. Through life, one is presented with obstacles, hurdles on the pathway. But then these are only a path, this is only a pathway, the obstacles are only a pathway, and hurdles are only a pathway for self-development and evolution. Otherwise, if there is no, one can see that one always, whoever is, say for example, the person who's believes in God or a creator and is going through a very nice life, no problems, the person does not typically think too much about God. I'm not talking about the people possibly in this group, but most of humanity. When everything is going fine, they don't think about God. But the moment there are obstacles, there are hurdles that are created, immediately their mind turns towards God. Please help. So just an indication that hurdles and obstacles should not be used as a methodology to go into sort of creating issues for oneself. Rather, use that as a tool to grow and think of the higher values, whether through God or through anything else. It doesn't matter. Use any methodology you require, but grow towards that eternal goal. And we can co-create our future, which is a key point. And this is where the aspect of the karma, prarabdha karma is. So prarabdha karma is the karma that is presented to us in this lifetime from moment to moment. Circumstances are presented to us as prarabdha karma from the crucible of what you call as sanchita karmas. And you have that cauldron of sanchita karmas and you get prarabdha karmas which are presented to you, and your response or your reaction is what would create a karma, a karmic impulse for the future. The idea is to try and respond in such a way that a karmic impulse is not created to add on to that cauldron which is already present to sort of perpetuate this cycle of birth and death, which is what we call as reincarnation. So one has to stop creating karmic impulses by one's actions here and now. Hence, he says we are co-creators of our future, which is a very beautiful point as well. And the response we provide with a balanced pathway helps to spiritually transform ourselves. This is to prevent creation of new karma or karmic consequences. So conscious spirituality is the need to evolve, and spirituality as a direction by authority told to us as a given is not conscious spirituality, because that is only through a belief system. And when there is a belief system based on someone telling you, there is no seeking. The inner impulse of an individual is seeking, not believing. Because whenever there is belief, there is no truth. There you're not seeking the truth, because you're only believing something which is not the truth. When there is true seeking, that seeking leads to higher spiritual evolution, which is called conscious spirituality. Rudolf Steiner talks about the Christ being as the Christ impulse. Similarly, in other traditions, there is also something called the Krishna consciousness, and so on and so forth, where you have you understand in detail how this impulse has to be used through conscious spirituality to evolve oneself onto higher planes of existence. So one has to understand in detail how reincarnation and the karmic karma operates, and work with materialism in a moral and spiritual way to provide the fruits of evolution. So now when the individual and we all as humanity are working through this manifestation in this world, it is very critical and very important to move in a moral and spiritual way. A vast proportion of humanity has a tendency to try and take shortcuts through life, try and have a tendency towards immoral actions. But here the direction is one has to move relentlessly, absolutely relentlessly in a moral way and spiritual way to be provided with the fruits of evolution. So within the world of materialism, use the results of science, he says, Rudolf Steiner. Within the world of materialism, use the results of science to grow into spiritual heights of finding your true nature through spiritual knowledge. So it is not shunning away science, as John very well beautifully explained, not shunning away the results of science and poo-pooing it, but using the results of science, because the body, the mind, the manas and the buddhi have to function in society. So while that I, the ego, the Atma, is still arrogating itself with the connection to that body, saying, I am this, until such time, moving around in a moral way is critical, very important. Once that is transcended and the ego is dispelled and seen for what it is as non-existent, and one is in self-abidance and self-absorption, then the body, the mind, the manas and the buddhi will function as it has to function, irrespective, because the ego, the I, is not associated with the manas and buddhi. It is operating as self through body and mind. So spiritual knowledge changes to suit the growth of the individual as the mind thins out. So what Rudolf Steiner says is that, and one can see that in many traditions, whether one is reading the Bhagavad Gita, or one is reading the Bible, or one is reading any of the scriptural texts of India and other traditions all over the world, one will note that whenever one reads the text, reads it once, the impact of it, the understanding of it at the initial stages, at the KG level, the kindergarten level, as it were, is different to the understanding of that same text as one progresses on the spiritual path or goes to a PhD level. The understanding becomes greater and deeper because of the very fact that the manas, which is the mind, gets thinned out. And when the mind gets thinned out, the focus becomes more clearer through the process of meditation and through all the techniques that one, spiritual techniques that one uses to grow. And when that happens, the mind becomes so thin that the understanding becomes more deeper and deeper and deeper into that very same spiritual text. And that is what Rudolf Steiner was indicating in this, when he said that spiritual knowledge changes to suit the growth of the individual as the mind thins out. This was the basis of what the teachings of Rudolf Steiner were, from a functional perspective within the framework of this manifestation, this world. But the key point to remember is that the manas and the buddhi, the mind and the intellect, as associated with the atma, which is the ego, the I, it's only then when the association is there with the manas and the buddhi, the I is associated with it, that all this is required. The moment this I, this ego, is disassociated with the body and the mind, because you never were that anyway, it's only notional, this ego, this I. When that disassociation takes place, functionality of the body and the mind, which is the manas and the buddhi, take place as self, because you always are, always will be that ever absolute pure consciousness, pure awareness, undifferentiated pure self. Through these practices, let us all evolve progressively, exponentially, to reach that realization of our goal, to find our true nature, which is the self, pure consciousness, pure awareness. Hari Om Tat Sat. Om Purnamadah Purnamidam Purnaat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijayji. So with that, we will bring this spiritual meeting to a close. We will stop the recording now. And thank you.